So I was thinking yesterday about why I'm on this path, why I seem so committed and have so much conviction about philosophy and trying to bring more of it into the world, trying to teach people, help people understand the importance of it, questioning ourselves, challenging ourselves, why I feel the need to try and commercialize it, even like scale it, why I want it to be significant. Why does it matter to me so much? What is it for me? And there's a whole thread of that, which is probably around my own ego, which is worth exploring and discussing. And I'll probably do that in another video. There's another piece of it, though, that I think I'll tell a story that I've told a number of times on my podcast. But it's just, I tell it so often because to me, it's the most effective way to communicate why I think this is so important. So the story goes, and I read it in a book, and I should find the name of the book to give credit here, but it was a story about a slave auction. And if you've heard it before, I apologize. I reference it often, but again, there's good reason for it. It was a slave auction in America in whatever year, let's call it in the 1700s. And the visual that was drawn, and it was somebody witnessed this, and I think they wrote about it in their diary. And it was found later on. There was a slave auction, and there was a woman in shackles who had been sold into slavery to somebody, and she was on the floor in front of the slave auctioneer, crying and pleading because the auctioneer, was holding her baby by the baby's foot and kind of dangling it because it was trying to sell a human being, a baby. And this woman was pleading to please, give her baby back, let it come back with her. And the man sold the baby to a different slave owner. And the visual and the trying to even fathom what that moment could be like for that woman to experience this, for her life, her real, like I'm telling this as a story. It almost feels made up. We know it's real, we know it's true, we know these things happen, but it didn't happen to us. So to try and actually fathom in real life, as real as me sitting here making this video right now, I could be in shackles, being sold as a human being, worthless, sold off to somebody to be abused and beaten and raped and tortured. And at the same moment, to see my child, my baby, my innocent, my blood, my family, my sole job in many ways on this earth to protect that thing, to see my baby being sold off in the same way. I'll never see them again. I can imagine the suffering they'll go through, tortured, raped, beaten, what have you, to have to know that and to live with that in that moment. And then even the very visceral, the anger and the frustration of witnessing it live and to see a human being doing it, responsible for it, and doing it willingly, probably even enjoying it. To witness this, to have this be real life, to know that an instant like that can happen in the world. And again, unfortunately, there's far too many instances of that have happened in the history of the world and still happen today in all different forms, just horrific human suffering. But for me, that one is just so potent. It's such a horrific, perfect storm of things that just makes you think, like, how can this be life? How can this be the world? How can this exist in the world? And that's why, for me, that's why I think this work is so important, because I can't imagine that existing in this world. I know it did, but I can't accept it. I can't accept that we're capable of that. I can't accept that we as humans can create that much suffering, that much pain, that much just pure horribleness, that we can create that and put that on other people. And my belief is that one of the key reasons why it does happen, why that did happen, why suffering in that form, unnecessary suffering that we create and put on our own species, our own other humans, is because we don't question enough. We don't really step back and question and understand what we're doing and the impact it's having. We don't allow that visual, that experience, that moment that I just described to truly sink in and feel it and understand that what the fuck, this really happened. This is real. Somebody had to go through, somebody did this to somebody, and then a big group of people did it. A system did it. A country, a world did this, and we're okay with it? How? No, it can't be. It can't be. I have to believe if we question more, if we think more, if we challenge ourselves more, if we force ourselves to really look at these things, to really try and understand what's happening, we will do less of it. I'm not naive enough to think we'll do none of it because I think we're too flawed. I think the world is too imperfect, unfortunately. We can get into a whole philosophical conversation about that. But even if it helps, even if it reduces it a bit, even if there's one less instance like that happens in the world, that has to be worth it. And I believe that it can happen. I believe it because we know suffering. We as humans, we know suffering. We know what suffering means, in whatever form it is. Hopefully, very few, if any of us, will ever have to go through that form of suffering that I described in that slave auction scenario. Story. True story. But we know we know at its core what suffering is. It's everything that's bad about the world. And when I say the word suffering, I don't mean discomfort, necessarily pain, because some of that stuff is necessary in life, right? We have to go through discomfort. We have to go through pain. A lot of the best things in the world come from that. And that's good. But not that story. That's different. I'll put that in the category, and I'm kind of making my own terminology here in it, but to me, that's the category of suffering, unnecessary suffering. Truly, that feeling, and there's no words to put to that. Suffering is the only word I could say. That feeling that comes with that. We know that. Again, maybe not at that scale, but we know what it means to suffer, to be in so much pain, and to know that it's not necessary, to know that it's not functional, to know that it's caused by something, and to feel helpless in it. We know that suffering. We all know it. We all know it. I'd go as far as to say it's what makes us decent people. It's what makes us decent as a species. Not perfect. We don't always get it right. But because we know that suffering on a very pure, literal, empathetic level, we know it. When I envision that scenario of the slave auction, and I try and put myself in that, as hard and arguably impossible as it is to do, I can feel a little bit of it because I know suffering. I can understand that concept. I can understand how horrific that is for that woman. I understand that. And because we understand that, I feel like we have a chance. That's what makes us decent. We know how bad that is, and we know that it's not a good thing. We should not put that on people. That's where the questioning comes in. If we could see it, if we could recognize, if we question enough to get enough clarity, cut through the bullshit, our ego, our biases, all the stories we tell ourselves because we're inherently selfish in some ways and we want what we want. If we could see that suffering for what it is, it's very hard for me to imagine that we would continue it. I just can't believe that. But here's the trick. Here's the problem. The double-edged sword of this. That same suffering, right? That we know suffering. We feel it. We know it. That allows us to be decent because we know we don't want more of that in the world. We don't want to be responsible for it in some ways. What allows us to be decent because of that is our fear of suffering. We know how bad it is. We know how bad it would be for us, so I can't put that on somebody else. It's just too real. It's too raw. It's too powerful, potent. We know that suffering. So we fear it. We don't want it. And that's the crazy part. That's the trick. Often the reason we put suffering on other people is because we're trying to avoid it for ourselves. We are so afraid of it, as we should be, because it's horrific. Sometimes we lie to ourselves. Sometimes we convince ourselves of things. Sometimes we'll do whatever it takes so we don't have to be the ones feeling that suffering because it's fucking terrible. And that's the game we're trying to play here. That's the challenge we're trying to overcome. Given the fear of that suffering, how much we don't want it, we can't have it. Given that fear, How do we ever be truly honest with ourselves to look at a situation and understand what it is when we're so driven to avoid that? It clouds so much of what we do and how we think. So we have to somehow cut through that to get to the truth of it, to get clarity. We have to question enough. We have to challenge enough. We have to probe, examine, dissect enough so that we can see it for what it is. It's not that I want people to suffer. I don't think we should have to take on the suffering, but that's the point. If we can all do that, maybe we can all find a way to alleviate it. Maybe we can all see a situation like that slave auction and recognize, no, this cannot, it's not acceptable. It cannot happen. Maybe that decent part wins, but it only wins if we can face the fear of the suffering that we have. And we can only do that by looking at it honestly, truthfully, with clarity. And we can only do that if we're willing to question, if we know how to question. It's not only willing to question, you need to know how to do it. You need to be able to build the skills to actually do it, which is an impossible task in and of itself in so many ways. But that's why I do this. Part of it, at least, the part that makes me sound like a good person. I'm sure there's another part that is driven in much the same of what I'm talking about. Ego, fear, all those things I'm sure play as well. But this is a very real part of it for me. That suffering, we have to do something to reduce it somewhat. And maybe this is the path to it.